Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Dune 2021. So, this movie is to be, like, in some ways similar to the original Dune film, and in a lot of others, they try to Star Wars this movie up. Like, if it didn't feel like Star Wars in the original Dune movie, you're gonna get a lot more Star Wars seemingly in this one. Going into this film, I would say, honestly, if I didn't understand this world before in the original Dune movie, this doesn't really help. If anything, there's so much dialogue just describing certain characters that I have even no clue of who they're really talking about, and I am just otherwise just really just unimpressed with this film, where really they, instead of going in better to help us understand this world. If anything, they did the exact opposite and just was like, oh, well, like whoever was to have watched this movie, read the book, has a complete understanding of the world. And so whenever anyone is to talk about anything, they're completely to easily understand this whole world of what it is. Because if anything, like we probably did a good enough job for them to help them understand the whole world, even in the last or even in the other Dune movie, which I'm like, no. Like, the ending of this movie does not have a good enough payoff, because really it's just like, that's it? Like, that's how you're going to end this movie? And I guess because they figured, well, hey, man, we spent enough money on getting certain characters in here for certain minutes of film. Because really, if we are to have that kind of same thing being done in the original Dune movie, it's not like we were going to see a huge extension of Jason Momoa's character or a huge extension of Josh Brolin's character or even Dave Bautista's character for that matter, because really these characters are to be used sparingly in this film. And so really there is to be, like, I would have thought that there would have been a much more Guardians of the Galaxy kind of appeal or approach to some of these characters, or eventually we would start to see weird and wild visuals like we did in the very original Dune movie. But instead they actually just kind of nerfed the visuals to where everything looked so, like, for the most point, besides the whole, like, of course, sandworm character that is to basically look like a giant butthole, pretty much. Really, we just have the visuals that just kind of feel nerfed, where it's just like, okay, so, man, in the very original Dune movie, like, immediately we end up having this giant fishbowl of a character being presented in the original Dune. And in this movie, we just go on to seemingly have the most blandest looking people that are presented in this film. And if anything, when a war breaks out in this movie, you don't even understand really quite who's on whose side, because there's a lot of certain color patterns that are all the same. So really, when you have kind of like the soldiers who are to be called the Sardaukar soldiers, you can't even tell the difference between those people and Leto's soldiers, who is of course the guy that you see right here. But yeah, but like I said, there are of course similar scenes to this Dune movie, to the remake, but it also feels like this is a movie that they are stretching out to eventually still seem similar to the remake film, but stretching that film out. So why not just go into the original Dune movie and really just watch that instead, so that way you wouldn't feel like this is to be a milked, stretched out thing. We also have the whole reason why to watch this film is the still suits, and to just kind of see how the still suits would be slightly different, and really we just have, like, also points in time where we kind of have this whole, like, kind of like who's who kind of people in this film. And really, I don't understand any of that. I just don't understand who any of these people are. Uh, and why should I care? Like, why should I actually care? Um, I don't know. I just have such like when really looking at like Star Wars, you know who the villain side is, you know who the hero side is. Like it's obvious. They kind of really help you figure out those sides of things. In this movie, like you don't know who anyone is because they all look the freaking same. Like all of them have like the same just kind of like color scheme to them. There isn't any kind of vastly different thing between any of these characters to really just showcase who is who in this film. In the Dune remake, I can really tell the difference between the characters and who's on the bad side and who's on the good side and who whatever. Like you can easily tell via that. This movie, just roll the dice and figure out who anyone is. Because it's so like everything is just so bland and everything is so nerfed visually. Um, Really, for the most point, for people who are kind of wondering who's really just going to be in this movie the most, really it just comes down to both the main character, who is Paul, who is on the very top here, and his mother, Jessica, who we end up seeing right here. She is in a bulk of this movie. Both Paul and Jessica are in pretty much this whole entire film, and basically F anyone else. Because what does it matter, right? It just matters about Paul and his mother, because basically Paul and his mother are going to be into this whole journey with one another. And then there is this weird cringe like moment where eventually Paul is to have to disrobe to change into his still suit, and his mother is just kind of looking on as like Paul is to like weirdly disrobe for whatever reason. And I'm just like, that is just so gross that we had to have that weird kind of scene there. Maybe it's just really that like Jessica is just kind of like kind of upset at the point a point that she kind of has to disrobe in front of her son and put on this still suit. But like when really looking at it, Paul, like I guess, doesn't have any quorums about it, because it's like, hey, we gotta put these suits on to survive, so hey, uh like basically like we just gotta chuck these suits on. So I don't know why that had to be a scene in this movie. That just seemed cringe and weird. So but yeah, so going on into this film, we end up having the Baron, that I think is slightly designed, like not maybe as interesting as the original Baron character. We find out that evidently Batista's character, Grasu, is to basically be the Sting character. He's to basically be on the villain side, and he is to basically be supporting the Baron character. And so, really, I can say that this movie does have star power. I can say that, but like, for how many minutes is it really to have star power? So, like, eventually, all these people are to eventually just be used for battle sequences, so eventually they can get killed off, a bulk of every single one of them. Um, but yeah, so like, plus the Hunter Seeker, like from what I remember from the like original film, like the Hunter Seeker, you can actually see that in the film, where in this movie you could like barely make it out, but like, oh, that must be the Hunter Seeker in this movie. Great. They again, like, there's so much about this movie that is just like the original, hence why when you really look at the trailers and how really the trailer from the original movie and this one are very familiar, basically to tell you there's just a lot of stretched out scenes in this movie compared to the original. But yeah, so really with that said, that's all I think I want to say about Dune 2021 in a very cryptic like sense. I'm going to try to do my best to do this in a spoiler sense, but more than likely it might just get to the point because this movie is so confusing. Um, there's really not an easier way to break this film down, but a lot of people would probably feel drastically differently. Like, no, it's even much easier to break down than the original version of this. Because there's so many freaking moving parts. It's 2.5 hours long, and really I would just rather go into like the best of parts of this movie rather than going through minute to minute and describing all of it. Because there's a lot of stuff that I honestly did not understand, because how could I, even though it's the same similar pieces of the original film. Still, it's just like, I don't understand this world, so I don't understand, like, I don't understand this world. Still, after now two variations of it, still don't understand it. Books, I'm not going to read a book to understand a film. That seems ridiculous. Uh, like, because I think that they just banked on the fact that, well, everybody read the book. Everybody's read the book. People shouldn't understand this world because they read the book. How about you just go and give us, like, an animated series of this to where, like, you can explain the world even better? That's what I think they should have done, is they should have done a Dune show, not a Dune movie. That would make no effing sense. To go and do another Dune film, you'd be better off doing a Dune series. So things could be stretched out and explained better. People could understand the world and the concepts around it. Really, we find out that spice is to be put in this film, and spice is to be supposedly a hallucinogen, but also has medical properties to help people and heal people. And it's also to be able to do uh, space travel. So, like, it becomes like the best of both worlds when it comes to people desperately needing the spice in this movie. And how everybody just, it breaks down into everybody mining and trying to find the spice in this film, because that's basically what ends up breaking down in the original movie. Is like, everybody's after this spice so that way they can go and heal people and also be able to travel, I guess, the world, I guess. But yeah, so with that said, I think that's all that I want to say about this in a cryptic-like sense. Let's hope I can ballparkingly somehow explain the original variation of this movie. What would I grade this film? Well, I would say that this movie is just a bad film. This movie is a bad film. It's a stretched out variation of the original. There's a lot better visuals in the original Dune movie, even though there's also some stuff in the original film that is seemingly so weird and so goofy that it's hard to explain. But at least that film looks somewhat kind of much more interesting than this film is. It seems to be quite easier to grasp the concepts or understand things better in the original film than this one. I don't know how many times in this movie they go through so many things of dialogue just explaining about certain kind of stuff, which I'm like, okay, this dialogue is immediately going to go beyond my head, because I'm like, who are even these people? What are they even talking about? I don't even understand, especially when both Paul and Leto are to go together and have this like stretch of dialogue where they're like explaining things. And it kind of feels like Leto is to tell Paul, it's like, well, I don't think you're really ready yet. And plus also, we have a moment with both Paul and his mother going off to this one Helen Mohiam, sure. Seemingly this Janius Helen Mohiam, who is supposed to be this kind of priestess woman that is to eventually kind of have Paul do this torture device to where he is kind of forced to use his ability, because supposedly women were supposed to use this skill, but instead Paul is to use this skill. because it's to basically keep him alive. So, with that said, one more thing before I go. Zendaya. Zendaya is barely in this film. Like, we get little flashes of her in this movie, but, like, basically the flashes that we get are as basically as equal as both Brolin, Momoa, Batista. That kind of tells you right there how much you're going to really see this character in this film. Um, Probably the most that we probably see besides Leto and his mother is probably, or both Paul and Jessica, is probably Leto. And probably yeah, those three are the only people you really see through a bulk of this film. Anyone else is just to be used sparingly. Even the villain in this story, who's to be Baron, you just consistently see flashes of him or whatever, and he is to barely kind of be involved in the whole fight thing. But anyways, pushing on. So let's go into spoilers. Let's go into this as best we can, because man, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So the very easy breaking down of this film, which is not going to be easy at all. The very first thing that I think we end up really just seeing in this movie is Leto ends up going and talking to this character who is to be called the Herald of the Change. Sure. This guy who is to come in with these astronaut-looking characters who are to, I guess, put forth some kind of treaty between these two people, and like it's all kind of a diplomatic thing and blah blah blah. A lot of political stuff kind of going into this show, or into this movie, I mean. And so eventually we end up having Jason Momoa come into the fray, and Jason Momoa has been spending a lot of time, I guess, trying to be an ambassador towards this guy who is to be Stilgard, who evidently is to be of a certain kind of people that kind of spend a lot of time in the sands. And so eventually Jason is to kind of figure out their ways and kind of understand the way that they do things. Evidently Stilgard, when eventually he is to be presented in this movie, immediately what he ends up doing is he ends up spitting onto this table. And like at first people are like, whoa, what the heck is he doing? And so guards are to be alerted and whatever. And so Momoa's character is to be like, wait a minute. Like, no, like, Duncan is his name. Duncan is to tell the guys, it's like, no, like, like, hold it a minute. Like, so Duncan is to tell Stilgard, it's like, we appreciate the moisture that you gave to us, because evidently these guys, the Stilgard and his men like to like spit into these certain kind of containers to, I guess, create water for themselves to drink. And so evidently spitting next to somebody is a sign of respect. So eventually Momoa is to spit, and then Leto or Duncan or Momoa is to spit, and Leto is also to spit, I guess, as a sign of respect. So I'm just like, okay, all right, this is like goofy and weird, but enjoyable. So even though I don't like spitting in a movie, but we just continue to have that. So it seems that Paul is to be trained by Josh Brolin's character, who evidently is to be Gurney Halleck. And so Halleck is to seemingly train Paul into using these kind of shields, which helps us helps us understand kind of their way of doing armory when they don't actually have armor on, but they end up having shields to kind of protect themselves. And so both Halleck and Paul are fighting it out, and I was expecting there for them to also bring in that huge like drone thing that kind of comes down uh as like a periscope kind of thing. Like if you guys have seen a lot of submarine movies, they would go and say the word like down periscope. You would have thought that there would have been this like drone like periscoping like thing that would come down and have Paul forcibly fight that thing. But instead, we don't have that at all. We just have Josh Brolin's character fighting Paul in this place, and I'm just like, wow, that freaking just sucks. Like, we also had Leto's character going and talking to the Herald of Change, and in the original Dune movie, we end up just having this like fishbowl thing coming and addressing what is to be Leto's character in the original Dune. And I'm like, wait a minute, we don't get fishbowl monsters thing? What kind of garbage is that? Well, I guess we don't have the threat of whatever fishbowl thing has to go and fight in this movie. I guess it was a random thing to have in this film, but still, like, whatever. Like, I want giant fishbowl looking thing to just be in this film. But whatever. I don't know what exactly that was called. I don't know what the technical thing is. Go ahead and check out the original Dune and just, I don't know. But anyways, so yeah, so pushing on. So, uh, like the goofy thing of it is that, like in the original Dune, like the original main character eventually gets quickly represented and sees, like the Josh Brolin character, the Jason Momoa character, and whatever, like right away, and like we end up seeing like certain characters presented to Paul right away, and they all are to be going on and having these certain kind of things with them. Like I think Patrick Stewart's character weirdly has this like cello with him in the original Dune, to just kind of tell us that this is to be back on Earth, where eventually they make it back to Earth. It is like, but they also have to tell us this goofy year of what year it is from this Earth. So Paul eventually is to go with his mother to talk to this priestess that Jessica had, I guess, eventually learned from. And so Paul is to see this woman, and so she is to tell him to put his hand in this one box. And so this priestess, who's to be Helen Mohaim, I don't know why I'm pronouncing it like that, but she is to put this like little dagger, a little kind of, like it's like the size of a pen, so dagger sounds weird for me to say, but she ends up putting this little like knife next to Paul's neck and has him forcibly put his hand into this box. And so eventually Paul is tested here, and so eventually Paul is to be tortured with wanting to supposedly take his hand out of this box, but then eventually Paul is to realize that he is to just seemingly ignore pain, and so then eventually it seems that he is to win this trial. And so, but this woman is still upset with Jessica because really she did not want this boy to be trained in a thing that only most females would be trained to do. But Jessica's like, well, oh, well, like, I'm trying to protect my son, and so, and plus, Paul is to be next in line for this crown, and so if anything, like, we can't ignore that this guy should be trained for this regardless, so that way he can have the best chances to be able to continue to live. So we eventually have Batista's character, who is to uh, 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 Grosu, Rabon, Grosu Rabon. Uh, sounds like I'm speaking Italian. That's to be Dave Batista's character, and so he evidently is to have a brother named Piter, and they both look the same. But then he is also to have Baron, who is also his like relative. So eventually, Rasu is to talk to Baron, and so eventually this leads to having Rasu eventually going and having a war out with Leto's people. And so eventually this all breaks out in a very Star Wars like manner where eventually Josh Brolin or Hollick is to eventually go out and try to fight within this war, and eventually he is to eventually get taken down, as well as Jason Momoa, when it seems that a lot of the uh, Sod uh, Sadarkar freaking people come in and try to create war with Leto's people. So pushing on. So there's this whole war that ends up breaking out. A hunter seeker ends up going into trying to kill Paul, but eventually the hunter seeker does not spot Paul right away, but eventually someone is to open his door, and so Paul is to grab the hunter seeker with his hand and capture it and to kill it. And so Hollick is to be so impressed that he's like telling the story of like, well, hey, this guy captured a hunter seeker and easily went off and captured it with his own hands. Like, woohoo! So really, we have Leto's second in command, which is Thufir Hawat, who is to basically at some point just want to tell Leto, it's like, well, hey, I failed you, so I'm going to immediately resign. And Leto's like, don't freaking resign. Like, no. Like, if anything, just kind of contemplate your mistakes and just keep on working. Like, it's stupid. We end up having also this doctor person who is Wellington, who is to try and do some health inspection on Paul in one point, because Paul is to eventually have these nightmares or these dreams or whatever. And so Wellington is to come in to try to see if Paul is to really be all that healthy. And eventually Wellington is to tell his mother, it's like, healthy as a horse, like there's nothing wrong with him. So because of course Paul is to have these dreams that he is to see Zendaya's character, and eventually he is to see his own death, supposedly. So he's to see Chani, who is Zendaya's character, who he's to meet somewhere in the sands, and that eventually he is to get stabbed by someone that we aren't sure yet, until we get towards the later part of this film to kind of see if this comes true or not. So it seems like Paul is to be able to tell his fortune, and so that's why Paul eventually ends up going to Jessica's like priestess woman to just kind of check things out. And that's when we have this woman who is to kind of tell Jessica, it's like, well, hey, you never should have had him trained to do this. like hence why you're going to have the problems that you're going to have. So pushing on. So eventually how this all breaks down is we end up having a war with the Sardaukar, which is basically the Baron people, and Leto's people. And so this whole war breaks down, and so eventually Leto is to go on and put a shield upon himself, but doesn't really do much good with that, because eventually there is to be, I think, a hunter seeker that ends up finding him and kind of killing him anyways, or kind of just paralyzing him, to the point of Wellington is to the nurse is to eventually give Leto this tooth, this fake tooth, to eventually break it and to spew out this poisonous gas. And so Wellington is to say, like, well, hey, you're going to die anyways, so you might as well do something good. You might as well go and break off this thing off your tooth, and eventually, hopefully, this gas will be right by the Baron, and hopefully you'll be able to kill him also if you're going to die anyways. So eventually Leto is to be sent to where the Baron is, so the Baron can talk to Leto. It seems that the Baron is to quite possibly kill a little bit of people here and there, and we are to kind of see that the Baron has this kind of, like, instead of legs, he has this kind of like snake-like body at the bottom half of his like body. So eventually the Baron is to eventually talk to Leto, and Leto is to, like, it seems like he's naked. Like, you can't really tell from from basically like hips down, because table is covering it up, but I would assume, like, it seems weirdly that he's naked in this spot. I don't know why. But yeah, so Leto is to go and crack his tooth to spray out this poison, because Leto is trying to whisper something to where the Baron can't quite hear. And so the Baron kind of gets closer and closer to Leto and like, what is that? What are you saying? And so that's when Leto is to release this poison to try and kill off the Baron, but that doesn't really work. The Baron just ends up later in some kind of weird, goofy oil mud bath like thing to supposedly heal his wounds, which I guess was poisoning. So pushing on. So both Paul and Jessica are to run off because Jason Momoa had gone and tried to eventually defend Paul and tried to kill off a number of these Sardaukar characters to eventually get stabbed himself, and eventually did get killed, even though he had a shield on. Again, eventually Brolin or Hollick is to eventually say that there are blades that eventually can go through this shielding. So it kind of means that the shielding is kind of a waste of time to really just have, because eventually there's going to be weapons that are eventually going to break through the shielding and kill someone anyways. So what was the point of that shielding? I completely forgot about the one moment. So before this whole battle was to come off, we end up having also Leto and Paul and like certain people. I think Hollick also went, and they eventually went into this spice mining facility, but they ended up finding out that a sandworm was going to eventually take down this mining facility. And so eventually Leto is to try to desperately evacuate this mining facility before everyone was to die. So eventually there were only a certain number of people that were to get on every one of these uh, like ships that Leto was to have, but he's like, I don't care. We're going to try to get as many people as we can on this ship. And so evidently Leto is to go out there, or Paul is to go out there, and all of a sudden he is to all of a sudden start to have a vision at the worst possible time. And so eventually Leto is to grab Paul and to just kind of get him back onto the ship. And so afterwards, Leto is to just kind of discipline Paul for just like God, you were just so. It is such a risk for you to do anything, uh, and Paul has to realize that he is eventually need to be the person who takes the least amount of risk, because eventually he is going to eventually get the throne at some point of Leto's. So. But yeah, so since I got that out of the way, back into the battling. So we wind up to have both Paul and both Jessica eventually taken by the Baron's people. And so eventually what ends up happening is that because these Baron's people don't realize that Paul is to have this power that his mother has, because they end up gagging Paul's mother knowing she has this ability, but they don't realize that Paul has it. And so Paul, and we also have both Paul and Jessica who have these like weird hand signals that they do also. So if they can't actually talk to one another, they do these weird goofy hand signals, which I'm like, I thought in the original movie they could just talk with one another via their mind or something like that. But I guess now we just have them doing goofy hand signals, I guess, because I guess that seems like a thing that they can just do now. So Paul is to try to use his power, but the pitch isn't right, because we have Jessica who is consistently trying to trying to teach Paul how to use his ability to forcibly persuade people to do things. And so Paul does it at first and it doesn't quite work, but then he ends up doing it again. And so then both Paul and his mother eventually go and take control of these people and start going and killing them off, or having other people like kill themselves basically, and then they kind of dump them out of the ship. So eventually both Paul and Jessica are to eventually just head their ship into this storm and kind of let the storm kind of take control of their own ship. And so Batista's character Gluso, or Glosu, Batista's character, is to go off to the Baron and tell him like, hey, yeah, like Paul and Jessica had went into this storm, and nobody is to live through this storm. I'm sure that they are quite obviously to be dead. And so the Baron is like, well, great. So if anything, the bloodline is dead. So Paul and Jessica, I guess, eventually end up going into crashing their ship, because eventually it seems that they're slowly but surely losing kind of their flying ability with their kind of dragonfly-like ship. So eventually their ship crashes, and so they go out of their ship to eventually realize that they have to kind of quickly put on their still suits. That's when we end up getting the weird, bizarre, awkward moment between both Paul and his mother. And so eventually both Paul and Jessica are to try and head on to eventually find the guy of which that they have seemingly tried to talk to once before, which is Stilgard, and eventually talk to his people, and eventually try to make some kind of treaty or something of some kind. And so it's kind of interesting because both uh, Paul and Jessica are having to forcibly now walk through this desert, and they're having to forcibly walk through this desert in a certain kind of way, so that way the sandworms, I guess, won't pick up their pattern. So, but eventually the sandworm is to find seemingly Paul and Jessica anyways, make it closer and closer yet to these two characters, to eventually all of a sudden have there be some kind of sound thing, of a thumping that is to all of a sudden uh, interest the sandworm more. There is to also be this one spot uh, where is the girl's name? Uh, Light Kindness? Keeness? Good God. Uh, Eventually, this one woman who is to be the expert of the still suits, and it seems that Paul was the only one who understood how to wear the still suits, because eventually she ends up adjusting both Josh Brolin's suit and uh, and uh, and also Leto's suit, and then all of a sudden she ends up seeing Paul's suit, and she's like, wait a minute, like, why is it that your suit is like perfectly put together? And he's like, well, I just thought that it was that way. And so all of a sudden this girl starts speaking in a different language, and Paul immediately understands what she is to be speaking. And she's like, ah, so you're a person that knows things, like knows a lot about like any number of things, to eventually, I guess, be able to kind of speak to anybody and be able to just kind of communicate with them. So, uh, so pushing on, eventually Leiter, the guy who's supposed to be with Dave Bautista, eventually is to be killed off somewhere in this film, and we just kind of end up seeing his dead corpse just kind of flopping or is just on the ground, just dead, with his eyes kind of rolled back into his head. So, so eventually we have eventually Paul make it to Still Guard's people, and kind of eventually say that I guess they're going to team up together, and that eventually they're going to work to try to defeat the Baron. But eventually we have a guy named Jamis who decides to challenge Paul. And so with that challenge, like, because what ends up happening is, like, Jamis challenges Jessica, but since Jessica really just needs a champion, Paul decides to step up. And Jamis is like, well, okay, I'll fight you then. So we have Zendaya's character who ends up giving Paul this knife. And so Paul evidently is to know all good and well about this knife because he had seen it in a dream once, where he is to get stabbed with this knife. And so he's like, oh my God, like, this is setting me up to eventually go and die right here. So eventually Paul is to go and fight Jamis. And so they go on and they go to, like, go and do all these fighting scenes and whatever between these two characters, and eventually Paul is to go and kill this Jamis character by stabbing him in the back. Paul kind of refuses to want to kill Jamis and is forcing Jamis to consistently yield, but Jamis won't do that because this is a fight to the death. But Paul is to consistently ask this guy to yield instead of killing him off. Well, Paul ends up stabbing Jamis in the back, and so really this fight just finally ends. So eventually Paul is to go off with Zendaya's characters and still guard, and eventually go on to have us end this movie. So yeah, with that said, like, that's, I think, all that I really wanted to just say about this film. Halleck, or Josh Brolin's character, Halleck, and his soldiers at some point in the like when the whole war is to start breaking down, they end up finding out that there are so many like spice refineries that are getting basically uh like bombed on, or like explosions are happening during their spice refineries, and so all of a sudden that pushes these characters on to go into war. Uh, eventually have this invasion happening where eventually Batista and his men are coming in and trying to kill everybody off. That's what kind of spurs off this whole war of things, is just a war on spice. But I think we take down so many spice refineries that it really doesn't make sense. I'm like, why would you kill off the one place that has the resource you need? Because I guess eventually they can just figure that, like, oh, we can just come up with more spice. Or maybe it's just whoever has the most spice. And so it really doesn't matter if they just freaking take down one refinery. I guess they can just figure out a way of how to get just more spice. But with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie. Really just all over the place with this review, but I think I got like at least something out of like just telling everybody how freaking confusing this movie really was, and maybe saying some differences of both the original and the remake. But other than that, I'm just gonna get the heck out of here. This movie is just a Star Wars movie. I didn't really like it. I would say that this is a bad film. The remake or the original movie is so much better, I believe, in my own head. Plus, they get to the point a lot quicker than this movie does. Uh, plus, it's seemingly easier to break down in the original than this one. But with that said, I think we'll get out of here. Bye, everybody. Well, plus also in the original, they kind of use their people to the best of their ability. Where just kind of in this movie, it's just kind of like it seems that they just kind of like put this out there, just like, well, hey man, we're gonna stretch this out. We're gonna put together a 3 Dune franchise, and that's the obvious thing, especially with this goofy ending where you're like, like that's how they end the movie? Like, really? Anyways, but I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.